Welcome into another episode of the Division II Baseball Podcast. Before we get started with today's episode, we would like to shout out and let you know that the Division II Baseball Podcast is proudly brought to you by our good friends at Pro Baseball Radar. If you're looking to make smarter recruiting decisions in the transfer portal or on the JUCO circuit, Pro Baseball Radar is certainly your go-to resource for understanding player performance across all levels of college baseball. With their proprietary formula, they've placed stats from over 1,700 programs on the same scale. It helps coaches, athletes, families, and agents compare competition levels like never before. If you need to filter by home state, handedness, or other key factors, that's not a problem. If you want to see how players historically perform when moving up or down conferences, their one-of-a-kind transfer history database has got you covered. So save time, gain an edge, and make data-driven decisions with Pro Baseball Radar. Visit probaseballradar.com or follow them on X at Baseball Radar and schedule a demo today. Pro Baseball Radar, because the right move starts with the right data.
Joined alongside Conference Carolina's Commissioner Chris Colvin. Commissioner, thanks for joining us today. We're talking about Conference Carolina's baseball. A lot always going on with that. And, of course, the KPI today, a big topic of our discussions. But first and foremost, thanks for joining us. How's everything going?
Thank you. Pleasure to be on. Looking forward to talking a little bit of baseball, and things are going. I mean, it's late March in a busy spring sports season. As I was telling earlier, I mean, we this year, we sponsor 28 total sports this year. We'll be at 30 next year, and the spring is the busiest of those seasons with the number of sports going on. So there's a lot going on, and including baseball, which is having another fantastic season.
Having another fantastic indeed. In our latest rankings, we have 6 teams either in the top 25 or receiving votes. But within that, we want to get just right into it. Starting March 31st, so this recording was prior to March 31st, you'll start updating your KPI daily on your website for standings. So first, talk about what was the idea behind instituting KPI? I would assume not just in baseball, but in other sports, as well as, why you went with that decision compared to maybe other alternatives.
Yeah, so I think the first thing I'll share is, we actually had baseball is a year behind some of our other sports in utilizing KPI to seed our conference tournament. So you got to look kind of big picture at Conference Carolinas. We this year are at 15 institutions. We'll be at 16 institutions next year. So for many of our sports, we are using a 3-division model where teams play the teams in their division twice and certain other teams once, and certain teams they don't play at all. And so a year and a half ago, when we were implementing that model, there was real I don't know about concern's the right word, but there was an acknowledgement that we will have some really significant differences in the strength of schedule of different teams. And so we instituted this concept of seeding our conference tournament by a computer metric, and the one we've chosen to use right now is KPI. We did that a year ago in the sports of men's and women's basketball, men's and women's soccer, softball, and women's volleyball. And overall, it went well. I mean, it's a different dynamic. It's certainly challenging for coaches when they don't know going into the last day of the season what's going to happen if I win or lose and another team wins and loses. So there's some challenges there. But at the end of the day, our ADs felt like KPI was producing a more fair method of seeding the conference tournament. So now let's talk baseball, which is what you guys want to talk about. Conference Carolinas baseball, we believe, is the strongest baseball conference in Division II. I mean, fantastic baseball from top to bottom. I mean, our top 8 teams this year have a 750 winning percentage in their non-conference competition. And we also are growing. So we have 13 baseball programs this year. We'll have 14 next year. There's just so many weeks in the season to get a 3-game series in. Baseball is not a sport that lends itself to that model I described that we do in basketball, for example, where you're going to play certain teams twice and other teams once, and like in soccer, maybe other teams not at all. Baseball doesn't lend itself because of the 3-game series concept. So what we essentially determined for this year, we're playing 10 series in baseball, so 30 games. And then next year that'll jump to 33, 11 series, 33 games. But with the cap of 50 overall, I just mentioned before, if you're a strong conference, you want to play non-conference games because you believe you got a good shot of winning those games. Like I said, our top 8 teams are winning 3/4 of their non-conference games right now. So we did not want to get in a situation where we're playing 36 or 39 conference baseball games and then not giving the strength of our conference the ability to show itself through non-conference. And then in addition to that, there's just not that many weekends to get 3-game series in if you got a really big conference. So the first decision before KPI came on board was we're going to limit. We're not going to play everybody. So we're going to play this year. We're playing 10 out of 12 opponents. Next year it'll be 11 out of 13 opponents. And we actually did that last year as well without using KPI. And what our ADs saw after using KPI in basketball and soccer, et cetera, and not using it in baseball, what we saw was that when you don't use a metric like KPI and you just seed your conference tournament based on win-loss record, because we have so many really strong programs, if there's an institution that maybe didn't play 2 of our top 4 or 5 teams, well, they've got a significant advantage in getting a better win-loss record. And then the reverse is true. If you've got an institution that didn't play any of the top programs in the conference, then their schedule is a little bit weaker. And so they've got, and it's just a lot harder to get that record. So the idea is when you're comparing win-loss records, when the schedules are imbalanced, or in this case, when there's 6 games that could be completely different on one team's schedule from another, what our ADs ultimately concluded was we've liked what we've seen with KPI in these other sports, so we're going to implement it in baseball as well, where we're going to seed our conference tournament based on the metric of KPI, because it's going to take that strength of schedule into account, and therefore it kind of balances out the notion of, well, team A missed these 2 teams on their schedule and team B missed these 2 teams on their schedule.
Thanks for that explanation. I think so just to be clear, it's the first year for baseball using KPI, but for the Conference Carolinas, you've done it before. Now in the midst, you've done it a couple of years for basketball. Was it something, and I get from what you're saying, as the conference has expanded, this was a decision that the coaches and ADs thought would be a good solution for baseball. Now, I do wonder, for the 2 opponents that you do miss for each team, is that just a rotating year by year thing, or is there any thought that goes into it? Because looking at some team schedules, it's like in baseball, if you miss Young Harris and North Greenville, it's good, you think, for maybe wins, but then I guess that would hurt your KPI.
It would be hurt in your KPI, exactly. So, I would say the coaches had concerns about the imbalance of the schedule, but at the same time understood that we didn't want to play too many conference games, because then we're ultimately, for example, in an extreme world, if you only played conference games, then you're not going to understand or realize the strength of a conference, if that makes sense. So the coaches weren't quite sure what was the best solution. The AD said, look, we've seen KPI work. We've seen it work in these other sports. We feel like it's going to give us a better representation of seeding for the conference tournament than the straight win-loss record would do. And so that's ultimately why they did that. In terms of the process to identify the teams you don't play, yes, it's on a little bit of a rotating basis. The other factor is geography. What we essentially did was, an institution is not going to miss, say, maybe their 2 shortest road trips, like the institutions that are closest to them. But with all the schools scattered about, you might miss the school that was the 5th closest to you, but you're not going to miss the top 2 or 3 closest institutions to you. And other than that, we're just going to rotate it from year to year. If our conference were to grow even more, we've kind of capped. We think that 11 conference series / 33 conference games is really the max that we want to go to. So we could find ourselves in a position where it's, 11 out of 14 opponents in the future. It could be more than 2 opponents that are missed. But ultimately, we just felt like this results-based metric concept produced a seeding that would be more appropriate than just the straight-up win-loss record.
And before we get into kind of like what is a part of KPI, I do want to ask, with adding Shorter, you added Young Harris a couple of years ago, a couple of teams in Georgia. How do you try to balance, being able to optimize travel for every team, not just in baseball, but for every sport, to kind of mitigate, those costs behind traveling?
Right. Yeah. And that's a big part of, I'll talk about other sports first. We created the 3-division model to do exactly that, to help us regionalize scheduling. So you're in a division with those institutions that are closest to you. And that's why we're in 3 divisions instead of 2, because if we split our conference in 2, we would have institutions that had 100 miles further to travel out of in division than they did out of division. So just the geography of the layout of our institutions led us to the 3-division model. Because of the 3-game series in baseball that I mentioned before, it just doesn't lend itself to that concept. So the way we're trying to do this is essentially just we're rotating over time the institutions that you don't play while protecting those that are the closest to you. And so that way it still promotes those very close regional rivalries, and then over time just spreads out how often you're not going to play Mount Olive, or how often you're not going to play North Greenville or Young Harris, or whatever institution has regularly been at the top of the conference.
And just for the fans of baseball, now it being new to them, what goes into KPI just when we dive into it? And just off of that, with the 3-division format for basketball, was it UNC Pembroke that finished first for KPI this past year?
It was, yes.
Okay. And so they went 7-1, but there were some other teams 8-0 within their division. So I think that's just a good note to know what goes into it. And then my other question is it for KPIs just for conference games, or is it your whole season?
Yeah. So let me first, so KPI as a general comment, not what we're using, not the version we're using. It's just an entity that it's out there. It is a very well-respected, robust, sophisticated computer metric that is a results-based metric. It is one of the primary criteria that the Division I men's and women's basketball tournaments used to seed March Madness. It is one of there's different kind of metrics out there, and I think this is important to note. There's results-based metrics and there's predictive-based metrics. A predictive-based metric is trying to predict who's going to win a game, and it's trying to tell you basically who's the better team. A results-based metric, which KPI is going to tell you who has the better resume. So one of the things that the creators of KPI will say is, if we're talking baseball, 30-game series at the end of the season, if North Greenville went 24-6. But Mount Olive went 22-8. The question is, which was harder to do? Was it harder to go 24-6 against this schedule, or 22-8 against this schedule? And that's who's going to be the higher team in KPI. KPI is not going to tell you they think that Team A is better than Team B. A predictive-based metric would do that. So that's the key thing that I have to kind of remind our coaches sometimes. If you may have a better record than a team and you're behind them in KPI. And that's not because KPI doesn't think you're as good as that team. It means that they believe that it was harder to accomplish what that team did with their record than what you did with your record. So it's really that's what KPI is, a results-based metric. I think it's one of the best ones out there for that. So Division II baseball, it is one of the tools that Division II baseball will use this year for selecting teams. One of the 4 or 5 tools. It's one of the 5 or 6 tools that March Madness is using. And what we have done, though, is we worked with Abacus, the creators of KPI, and we asked them, so look, we're just seeding the conference tournament. We just want this to be based on conference results. So we have a conference only KPI. So if you go on the website right now where KPI is published, you could see that a national KPI listing and you could sort it by Conference Carolinas and you could come up with a ranking of 1 to 13 based on their whole season right now. But what we're going to release on Monday, March 31st, and then daily after that until the season's over, is a conference KPI that's only going to take into account those conference results. And that's how we're going to seed our conference tournament. What goes into KPI? It's really simple. It is the result of the game, the location of the game, and essentially how good was your opponent. And so a win, so a win is worth, as a default, a win is worth between 0 and 1 point. If you beat a really, really, really good team, it'll be very close to 1, 0.9, 0.95, 0.8, something like that. If you beat a team that has not won many games, like a weaker team, you may only get 0.01 points for that. But it's going to be between 0 and 1. A loss is the reverse. A loss is between 0 and -1. You lose to a really good team, you're not going to lose a whole lot. You're going to lose -0.015. You lose to a team that you really probably shouldn't have lost to, or that team it's their only win of the season, you might lose close to 1.0 points for that. And then essentially you average all those together at the end of the year. There's a little bit of a twist in there where there's a shift for home away. So there's a home away adjustment. So, doing whatever you did on the road is going to shift it a little bit this direction. The home's going to shift it a little bit this direction. And KPI is basically learning throughout the season. So I describe people, KPI is more like an AI. It's an artificial intelligence that's literally learning throughout the year how good the teams are. We can see on the back end some of the results early in the season. And it's really interesting when there's only 3-4 games played. I mean, it's a little wonky, the ranking of the KPI, because it doesn't make a lot of sense intuitively. Once you get half, 3/4 of the way of the season in, it starts making a lot more intuitive sense. Because at the beginning of the year, KPI doesn't know anything. The computer doesn't know anything.
And you kind of talked about it a little bit as you were mentioning KPI, but I kind of want to ask in terms of that, like a fluctuation, right? Maybe KPI thought this team was strong, but they get swept at home. How much does that affect the team that won in that 3-game series? And then how much does that affect, maybe 2-3 weeks later?
Yeah. And the other question there is, how much does that affect every other team that played them earlier in the year? Because the other thing you've got to realize is the KPI value that you earn from a given game is not a fixed number. It changes every day. So if a team that you played early in the season and you swept, if they all of a sudden tank and get swept at home in a series they probably shouldn't have, a week ago, KPI thought that was a great result you had early in the season. Well, now it's not a great result anymore. So it is constantly moving. So that's the one thing that all of our coaches and ADs and everyone has had to follow as they're understanding KPI through the season, is there is significant fluctuation based on the results that happen. And when you go play a game, every other game that's played that day in the conference is influencing your KPI, because all of your past results that you thought you were earning 0.250 for a particular win, that may now become 0.150 after the results of that team. So that's why that's the frustration going into the last week of the season. You're not going to know if I go 3-0, I'm going to be the number 2 seed. You're not going to know that anymore. That's the biggest. Oh gosh, this is hard to figure out. Which is why on the last day of the season, we work with the folks that run KPI to update it in real time. Basically, a game finishes, we text them the final score, and they update it. So we're trying to update it. We update it daily throughout the season once we release it. And then on the last day of the regular season, we'll update it as soon as games finish, so teams can quickly see the impact of those results. So it's a unique animal, a unique situation. But one thing I'll tell you, and this is I'm not giving out any secret information here because nothing's been decided. But you talk to anyone around Division II, and they will understand this is on the radar. Division II is seriously looking at, probably not next year, the year after that, moving to a single results-based metric to select teams for the NCAA tournament. Like, that is on the table. I don't know if it's going to happen, but it is on the table. And if you guys, I know this is D2 baseball, but if you guys follow D3 baseball at all, that's what they're doing. D3 this year has moved to, it's called NPI, and it is for all of their team sports. In order to qualify for the championship in Division III this year, you have to be, they're doing it solely based on these computer rankings of NPI. NPI is in category the same as KPI. It's a results-based metric. It's just a little bit of a different methodology. It's a little bit more linear. If you think about it from a mathematical term, it's more just kind of multiply this ratio by their strength of schedule, et cetera. Whereas KPI, what we're using right now, is more nonlinear, more artificial intelligence sort of based. But on the flip side, KPI is a little bit more harder to understand. NPI, what Division III is using, is a little bit more straightforward to understand. So anyway, I don't know what's going to happen, but D2 sent out a survey earlier this year. One of the questions on that survey was asking everybody, every coach, every administrator, president, what would you think of moving to a results, a computer model to select teams instead of the racks, et cetera. So it'll be interesting to see if that happens. No decisions have been made there, but in my personal opinion, I think this is the direction that things are moving. We started it last year. The MIAA this year used KPI for basketball and volleyball, I believe, were the ones they used. I don't know that 100%, but they definitely used it. So other conferences are looking at it, and it could be something that the NCAA is using at the Division II level in the future.
That's great insight. And I think overall, this is just a part of a greater conversation in college athletics, because as conferences expand, like you talked about at the beginning, things are going to be unbalanced, whether there's divisions, whether there's not divisions, because you can't possibly play everybody as these conferences continue to grow. So it makes total sense. And in terms of the NCAAs, if that's a big metric that you use, it would make sense for the conference to use that, because as a very proud commissioner of Conference Carolinas, and just knowing how good baseball is, you hope to get a lot of teams in the NCAA tournament, so you would at least understand how they're going to be valued. And again, it's not reinvented the wheel. Like, teams that win the most are going to be the teams that top the standings, but it is helpful to realize what's going to happen. And especially when we go into conference tournament, I know specifically with Conference Carolinas, it's one of the most coveted conference tournaments in my eyes. I think it's the biggest. 10 teams go. It's Wednesday to Sunday. It's a lot of fun, and it makes a lot of sense for all the teams to be judged. And you're kind of playing in a regional before you go to the regional the following week, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we love the location of our championship, the facility we're playing in Gastonia, North Carolina, state-of-the-art, fantastic location. We bring 10 teams in. We do the 7 through 10 seeds have to win a single elimination game on day one. So 2 teams go home on day one, but after that, it's an 8-team, kind of the old school 8-team double elimination championship, where you got to have some pitching to get through it. And it's a challenge, and it's a lot of fun to have everybody there. And so we want to make sure that we're seated as appropriately as we can be. And if one team happened to have a much more difficult schedule than another, but their record is maybe not quite as good, it might be the case that team should be seated higher than somebody else. And that's what KPI helps us figure out.
And yeah, within that, you did mention that it's updated daily and on the last day as, the games go final. But, how do you think in your eyes that impact is, going in that final weekend, hey, we just got to play well, because of that 7 through 10 seed single elimination, where it could be anyone.
Yeah. And like I said, you look at our standings right now, the team that's going to be the 7th seed in our conference tournament is going to be a team that Division II baseball fans typically view as a very, very good Division II baseball team, with the depth that we have in the league, and who's sitting, potentially in 7th, 8th place. They're going to be teams that probably at some point this year were receiving votes, or were ranked, or had a regional ranking, just because of that depth. And I said that the top 8 teams in our league have at least a 750 winning percentage in their non-conference play. So it's going to be a little frustrating because they're going to go into that last day not really knowing what they need, but at the same time, that just means you got to go play and win. You can't. All right, we got one win, we're safe. You're going to have to go in and try to win both games on that last day because you just aren't going to know what another game is going to do and how that's going to impact your KPI.
So just to recap a little bit, KPI coming out here pretty shortly for Conference Carolinas baseball next Monday, right?
Monday, March 31st will be the first release. At that point, it'll be live on link from our website to the site where KPI is housed. And then at that point, it will be daily all the way. Well, and of course, baseball's not really played daily in the conference. But basically every day that there's a game, there'll be an update to that. And that'll be true all the way until we get to the end of the regular season, the last week of April.
And also, so that's a good to know. So Conference Carolina baseball fans, coaches, everybody involved, be watching out for that. And then also just to clarify, because I'm sure some people just don't understand it. I wonder too, like, have you got any pushback on this, or is it everyone in support? Because the interesting aspect of a win could be worth 0.9 in February, but then that win could go down to 0.5 if that team struggles. Is there any like pushback that you've gotten? What have those comments been like mainly?
I mean, I'll say this at the AD level, we have the ADs have been pretty universal on, at least across the board, as we haven't done baseball yet, but through the other sports, that this is the process we need to be doing, and they're fully supportive of that. Is every coach 100% supportive and excited about it? Probably not. I mean, but is every coach excited about any decision that a conference or a group of ADs are going to make? No. And a lot of that is the uncertainty at the end, because and again, especially it's the scenario where you have a good record and you're now slotted behind somebody that had that didn't have as good of a record, and you don't really understand why. I mean, the answer is, well, that team played a tougher schedule, et cetera. But so I'd say, yes, our institutions, our ADs believe this is the direction we need to go. We think we're going to potentially be on the front curve of this. That's going to start happening with lots of conferences and happen nationally. And even if that's not the case, we believe it has served us well so far. It will be interesting to see how baseball goes. I think the 3-game series concept of baseball and the tripling impact of these games will be interesting to follow. Because quite frankly, as you think about this, you could have a scenario where if you look at one particular team's season results, you could have a situation where there was one series you went 1-2, let's say, against one of the top teams in the conference. And there's another series where you went 3-0 against one of the bottom teams in the conference. You're actually going to earn more points for going 1-2 against that elite team than you're going to earn from going 3-0 against the team that's lower, because of the magnitude of, when you lose to a good team, you're going to lose points, but not a lot. But then when you beat that team once, you're going to get a bunch of points. So it's going to balance out. Whereas if you play the last place team in the conference and you sweep them, that's going to be 3 small numbers, if that makes sense. So that'll be interesting to see how that plays out. I think there's going to be a lot of movement during the season that may be challenging for some. I think that at the end of the season, when we look back on it, it will likely make sense. During the season, as things ebb and flow on a daily basis, is not going to always be intuitive to everybody.
And the final question I have for you, Chris, to be respectful of time, is, having this, you kind of mentioned, that having this allows you to create more competition where teams will be more incentivized to win more games to improve their KPI. But also another thing is you have your conference tournament first amongst all conference tournaments on April 30th. Talk a little bit about having that so early compared to the rest of the Division II, and being able to say, hey, like, we're going to put on a great show because, again, your broadcasts are free of charge.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I mean, we continue to operate in the free to view platform with our digital network right now. We're about a week earlier than we would need to be, and our ADs have voted to continue doing that. I mean, it does a couple things. It helps a little bit from a financial standpoint of not, I mean, especially when we're bringing all 10 teams to the tournament, that's not all those 10 teams that have to stick around maybe after graduation or dorms close and things like that. So there's a piece of that that's important to the ADs. You know, the other pieces, you know, with an AQ deadline on a Sunday, if you're butting right up to it, you have weather issues, things like that. You're much more crunched and run into issues. And especially with the idea of wanting to have this large tournament, it would be a lot more challenging to conduct that a tournament as large as that if it concluded like on the day of the AQ. And then of course, what if you have rain delays, et cetera? You know, we could back it up a little bit where it was the start on the weekend and go into the week. And there are a couple of conferences that do that. But ultimately our ADs have liked the idea of the kind of culminating the championship on that weekend. And then we use Monday. Monday is the if necessary game in our current model.
Well, Chris, thank you so much for taking the time to explain all of that. And it is really cool to see how Conference Carolinas has grown under your direction. 6th year as the commissioner. The digital network is at the top of the line. The conference just across many sports is at the top of the line. And you're doing some innovative things like KPI that help all these programs get represented in the best possible way. So Robert and I, in our humble opinion, you're one of the greatest leaders in Division II athletics. So we're grateful for your time.
I appreciate it. Thanks, guys.
And that is Chris Colvin, Commissioner of Conference Carolinas.